Thank you.
I must ask you. We always have this problem on BBC. We always say ownership, but actually it's ownership. Good morning, good morning. Thank you very much indeed for joining us for this conversation, which will, for the first period, be between me and the High Commissioner, but then I will invite you to put some questions, have some comments, perhaps your own experiences, and how they relate to this desperately important work, and can there ever have been a more important time for the human rights work of the United Nations to be recognized. Unfortunately, as you will be fully aware, against the background of all the other turbulence in the world, the work of the UN Human Rights Commission and Commissioner does not perhaps get the attention from people like myself, who are journalists and with a global audience. It's a fact, particularly today when we're totally obsessed with the imperial anxiety of the United Kingdom in the context of Brexit, but that's a different story and we'll come to it later. So welcome to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, who was, of course, as you know, herself an activist in Chile when human rights were being denied to people who were fighting for their freedom, who suffered, and we'll perhaps ask you to tell us a little bit about that story, and then who became the leader of her country in what I suppose was called the pink wave across Latin America, when left-wing parties began to be more and more powerful and better organized, or were able to organize. Madam Commissioner, there are very many, I used the word turbulence, which I think I took from one of your recent reports. There are very many things we could talk about. Cambodia, Assam, where nearly 2 million people have been suddenly told they're stateless, in effect. Yemen, I mean the list. We'll come to some of those. I wanted to ask you to begin with, to talk about success, actually, because the mechanisms that you have at your control do achieve, they do bring people into confrontation with the reality of their lives around them. They bring their governments to attention, they hold them to account. So perhaps you would start by talking about why you took this job on, because you wouldn't do it if you didn't think you could achieve success.
Well, I don't know. Maybe it's just that I cannot help it, or maybe I'm a masochist. I don't know which is the reality. Yes. But the thing is that when the Secretary General asked me to become a candidate, because it was not that I was appointed directly, I became a candidate, went through the whole process of interview, etc. And afterwards, I was recommended by the Secretary General and approved by the General Assembly. But the thing is that, of course, I was finishing my second term as president. I've been in UN Women before, and I'm not young anymore, so everybody will believe, okay, now it's time to do something else in life. But then the Secretary General mentioned to me that how important it would be that I could contribute to an issue that is so, in this so difficult times, you know, when multilateralism is under attack, when human rights are being pushed back, when gender rights are being pushed back, to have somebody with my experience in this position could be really a contribution. I'm not sure if I will succeed, but anyway, I did say, okay, I'm going to participate, I'm going to be a candidate, and finally I was selected. And of course I have to say, some days I ask myself, if I really knew, would have said yes. But because the things are much worse than I thought. I mean, of course, I knew things. You know, you are a person who reads, who see the television, you know the news. But I was not so aware of the so intense pushback in terms of human rights and gender rights. But anyway, I'm a person who has lived in politics for some years, who have been in NGO. On one hand, during dictatorship, I was part of an NGO who protected children against dictatorships. And on the other hand, I've been in office, so I could bring that experience to this position and try to do what I am supposed to do, that I'm supposed to ensure the full enjoyment of human rights worldwide and to fight against the obstacles of the implementation of the effective rights, and also to ensure sort of I would say, across the UN, that the whole UN system is really pushing forward on the human rights approach and the human rights responses.
When the Secretary General asked you, you must have looked at the toolbox. You know, yes, okay, I'll do the job if I've got the tools. What are the tools?
Well, I mean, first of all, I want to explain this because sometimes people get confused. The UN has a UN human rights system. And I am the High Commissioner of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So we are an office, it's like an entity like WHO, ILO, much smaller, yes, but we are supposed to be independent as well, because we need to be able to raise the voice when the voices need to be raised, to be the voice of the voiceless. And so we have, I mean, the Secretary General is my boss in one sense, but on the other hand, I have to respond to the world, and that is the mandate of the High Commissioner. I can speak. I don't need to ask him permission to speak on any situation. Then I would say I try also to work with my colleagues on WHO on different to push on common agendas. We try to add value to the Agenda 2030 from human rights point of view. We work on different areas to try to push the global agenda. That's what the office does. But we have also a presence on the field. For example, we're small, but compared to UNDP or others. But for example, in the Western Balkans, we have a team in Serbia, we have international advisors in North Macedonia, we will have soon an international staff on Montenegro. So we do work with countries here, but all over the world, not all over really, it's an exaggeration. We are in 76 countries, but we are like one human rights advisor at the resident coordinator's office. So we provide the human rights approach and based to all the policies that the peacekeeping missions. There is the human rights component of the peacekeeping mission. So we work with them as well to ensure that human rights are well worked there. And we also have country offices and we have regional offices. So, for example, we have the biggest office is Colombia, the oldest office is Cambodia. And then we have big offices in Guatemala, smaller in Honduras and Mexico. But then we have regional offices, for example, in Rosa, that is South Africa. For the South African countries, we have 8 colleagues for 14 countries. Or in Addis Ababa, in Ethiopia, we have 14 countries for people staff for 18 countries. So that's one of the things. But you were asking also, so that's one thing, the office. We work and work with them, with the country, with the government, with the civil society. We support the human rights defenders, and we try to engage governments in doing the right thing. And we give technical cooperation and technical assistance according to what government asks us. It could be the judiciary system, it could be rule of law, it could be prison, it could be that we're doing, for example, with the G5 Sahel Joint Force, we are starting a program to train the security forces and armed forces to do their counter-terrorism measure, but in compliance with humanitarian and human rights laws. So I would say, but you ask, and then we have the special procedures, those are special rapporteurs, that they're different. There are right now like 86 people, but in 50-something thematic or country situation. It can be the special rapporteur for extrajudicial killing, the special rapporteur on torture, but also we have a special rapporteur on indigenous people, people living with disabilities, lots of different issues that the Human Rights Council
But you have to work with the government.
Yes, I do work with
Because you mentioned Cambodia. I mean,
well,
Cambodia is a human rights failure. Nobody can define it any other way.
Yes. I think that there hasn't been a very positive result on that way. But on the other hand, because you started asking me about good stories and successes. Well, I've been for a year, so none of the good stories that I'm going to tell, I will say this is my merit. Eh? But I want to say is that with the European Union, we started talking about, okay, the world is enough, we have enough bad news, but does it mean that this cannot change? It can change, and it can be changed, so let's also think on the good stories. And I would say there are some good stories, and there are some good, initial good stories that we'll see how they evolve. Because they're not perfect, and many times they have to deal with complicated situations. For example, when in the Maldives, the government changed, and it was a new government democratically elected, they asked the Secretary General that if we could provide with human rights advisors, because they needed to change the constitution, they needed to change a lot of laws, and they needed this expertise that they didn't have inside the country. So we were trying to see how we send people there to support them. In Ethiopia, for example, the prime minister, he changed the constitution. He freed a lot of political prisoners. He had, for the first time, a paritarian cabinet, 50% women and men. They appointed a female president, a former colleague from the UN. She's the Ethiopian president right now. And they started to reform a lot of bills to make it a more democratic place to live. But that doesn't mean they don't have to deal with conflict sometimes, that they don't have protests, because that's democracy, you know. And many sometimes, but they're good stories. And we have seen it in some African countries as well, Asian countries. Still not enough to write a book, if I may say, but there are good stories. And there are good particular issues that, for example, Slovenia. And in Slovenia, there was this UPR recommendation on creating this advocate for equality. It was created. So there has been a lot of recommendation. And I think the Universal Periodic Review, the UPR, that is an instrument that I was outside, I didn't realize how important it is, because it's a peer review that countries accept. So they receive recommendations from everyone, and they receive hundreds, but they accept some 80%, some 60, 40, and then after 4 years they have to present what they have done. And it's a very interesting tool to work on human rights.
There's compromise in it. I think that's what you're saying. You have to work with the systems that exist and with the governments that exist. Now, how does your own story play into that? Because you had to run a country, you came from being an activist opposing a government to being somebody in charge of a government. How does that personal history teach you how to behave in this position, which after all is, as you've already described, full of frustrations, and you have to work with people who you wouldn't really sit down and have a drink with if you could help it?
Well, it's funny what you mentioned, because there was, I'm not going to say which country, but there was this woman minister, the government just changed, and she said to me, I've been always in opposition, and suddenly I started talking about the government, and suddenly I said, oh, I am the government. so for some people, this change is difficult, but in my case, because I was not immediately some person with political decision-making level, it was sort of a learning in democracy. I started I was a public functionary, so normal people doing normal stuff, and then to be able to, I would say, embody what democracy meant, and not a democracy that needed to be improved, because of course we came from a dictatorship, and we need transitional justice and so on. So, but my personal story, I think it's interesting, because for one hand, as I mentioned to you, I work in an NGO for children. I was the pediatrician because I'm a medical doctor, but also work, of course, politically, underground at the same time. I was a public person, but the political activity was underground. But on the other hand, then I could also work after we regained democracy in the public sector, and to learn how to deal with issues of the public sector, and I think, and then become minister of health first, defense afterwards, and then president twice. So, and in the middle I was UN Women Executive Director. So what I have thought it could be useful for this position is to try to bring, if I would say, the different perspective, to try to understand what are the challenges that, on one hand, public sector government has to deal with. On the other hand, civil society. And it's funny because I had a meeting with civil society because I was in prison, huh? And I was missing for not so long, but for some time. So I had that experience. So one of the person from civil society, he said to me, "I'm so happy that you were in prison and that you were ill-treated." And I said, "Oh, come on." Huh? But it was what he meant. We don't have to tell you the story. You know what it is to be there. And that's, I'm saying this because it's true. I mean, you know what is that. So nobody has to convince you. So I can, it looks strange, but I try to look at the situation with the eyes of the civil society, but also with the eyes of government. And I'm trying also that experience to bring it when I have to deal with governments, to try to put me in their shoes, to find what can be the arguments that can make them do the right thing. Because one thing that I learned in UN Women, and I was working and talking to President about women's rights, and that's the right thing to do, it didn't work. To be honest, it didn't work. It worked with the people who were already converted, you know? So I always think, it looks like the kind of language that I'm using is not useful. I need to think in a narrative that can make them ring the bell, if I may use that word. So I started thinking, how do I show them that it's the right thing to do, but the smart thing to do at the same time? A smart thing to do in many areas. It can be beneficial for them, for the people, but also for themselves. And this is particularly difficult because in countries where, you know, elections are every 4 years, politicians tend to think in the short term and not in the medium and long term, unless they really are for the civil service and not about their re-election. So I try also to bring that discussion, to say, look, this is good. I mean, women, it's important that are fully incorporated, indigenous people. I mean, your policies will be much sustainable if they are grounded in people's concerns, needs, and also solutions and so on. So at the office, I came as well to say, look, the narrative of principles and values needs to stay, but we need to think what else we need to do with governments to engage them, because states are the principal responsible of protection, promotion, and to human rights.
I want to ask you about your work with the rights of women in a moment, but listening to you talk about the way you're working with governments immediately distinguishes you from your predecessor, who I interviewed on the same stage a couple of years ago. You may not want to speak badly of him. There are plenty who do. Zaid al-Hussein was described as a total failure by many of those people with whom he worked. He was angry. You don't seem angry. You can understand why he was angry, because the things he tried to do, you know, he talked about this soporific international complacency, you know, and he said Rodrigo Duterte, the president of Philippines, needed a psychiatrist, and of course he was very rude about Donald Trump. Now, how do you approach those situations? Duterte is still there, people are still dying. Trump is still very much the dominant figure in a society that is still locking up children, and 7 have died. How do you deal with that without losing the ear of those people who can change?
Well, again, I will tell you about my own experience, and then I'll come to your answer. When we recovered democracy, and there was democratic elections, people became senators and PMs who were part of Pinochet's regime. So for us, young people who have fought against dictatorship was like, hey, but people elected them. So democracy is not perfect. So when I work and I had to defend some bills, I had to go there and sit with those people there who were, for me, the face of Pinochet's regime, civilians, not military. So you learn that in democracy, you don't have to work only with the people you like. You have to work with the people who are there, that have been elected by the democratic rules. But I have to say, democracy is not perfect. And I'm not going to mention any country, but I can think of many countries who have elected democratically people who are not very democratic. So that's one experience that I had to live with, and to work with people that really, for me, were the face of the military regime, the civilian face of the military regime. Because they're a part of the country who liked that people and wanted them to be part of the parliament. So that's one thing. The second thing is in APEC, I had to sit in the APEC meeting with both persons you have mentioned and with many others. So you have to relate when you are in my country, the presidents are the head of states and head of governments. So you have to meet, relate with people you might agree with, disagree with, or really respect or not respect. But it's part of the job. You need to, and you can have a frank discussion, or you can have a fantastic relation if you agree on important things with the people that you believe you can do things together. So I think my experience is different in that sense, that I had to be with many other presidents, I'm not going to name, that I did not agree on many things of them. So you work on the different areas, but you also understand that there are areas where you can put some questions. For example, in WTO you discuss on trade, and in Human Rights Council on human rights, and so on. So I would say probably my colleagues who have been for many years in the Human Rights Office, probably every High Commissioner was different. Everyone has his different ways of doing things. I mean, I didn't know the first one, Mr. Ayarza, but I do know very well Mary Robinson, Louise Arbor. I didn't met either Sergio Vieira de Mello, but of course Zaid and Nabi Pillai. So, and all of us are different. The majority of them are lawyers. Huh?
Would you like to spill the beans on your conversation with Zaid al-Hussein? Would you? When he knew you were going to take the job, he must have contacted you.
Well, we wrote down a WhatsApp, and then I came earlier to Geneva, and we had a meeting, and we spoke about many different issues there.
Did he say don't?
Well, with Zaid, we had a very good relationship in New York. He was the ambassador of Jordan when I was UN Women. So we have very good historical relations. So, no, he did not. Did he say don't? Let me remember if he said don't. No, I think he told me things that I didn't know that were there, pending issues that were there. And he did express in some way his feelings, in some ways. Oh, yes, he told me don't. He said, don't do dinners. Because your life will be miserable if you go everywhere to all the invitations that you are. But no, he was really respectful that everyone has to make its own decisions and so on. And I had very good relations with Zaid.
Let me ask you about Venezuela, because there was some suspicion, because you were once, as I mentioned, part of the pink wave, that Hugo Chavez was seen as being somebody who you supported, you admired the work he was doing for the poor people of Venezuela in the early days. But now we are where we are, and you've recently been in Venezuela, and you published a report. Did Nicolas Maduro, did he expect you to give a good report, actually? Is that why they let you in?
Well, maybe. I cannot say, but I mean, I think they let me in because they knew that I'm not an enemy of Venezuela. I'm somebody, as a High Commissioner, I mean, as a person, I can have my own opinions, but as a High Commissioner, I have to be objective, neutral, impartial. So, so he knew that I was not, if I may say, biased, because there are people who have already ideas and opinion before even going to the places. Maybe he expected a different report. To be honest, he didn't like the report, as you could have read some of his comments about me. But that is not rare. I mean, usually countries don't like when we make reports and we present in the reports what we have, our findings and or the allegations that we verify, that we receive from families, from victims, from people who have been tortured, etc., etc. I think, but on the other hand, I have to recognize that they did a big effort in that visit, because a group of our people went, 4 colleagues went in March to prepare the visit, and they could visit everywhere and they could talk to a lot of people. And then we went June or July, and we could visit and talk to everyone. So I had meetings, of course, with governmental, militaries, social ministers, etc. Of course, the president, and with the president of the National Assembly, with Juan Guaido, yes, and a lot of parliamentarians of the opposition, but also with Diosdado Cabello, that is what's called the Constitutional Assembly, National Constitutional. I mean, with everyone.
Sorry to interrupt, but you met a lot of ordinary people as well, didn't you? That was the point.
Yes, I was in meetings with, ordinary people, yes, but ordinary people who have problems. Huh? Not in the street, anyone who was passing by. This was organized by NGOs, foundations that were there with families of people who are in prison, who are tortured. There was a big group of Colombian people who have been in jail. And for example, I did have meetings with doctors and nurses and mothers of children that were in the children's hospital. And I had meetings with people from pro-governmental and opposition, from universities, trade unions, women's organization. It was like preparing parallel, but organized, well organized. So I could listen to many, many people, really. So I tried to present in the report that reality, that there were violations of human rights. But on the other hand, in March we have presented as well some reports on this, that there were also being people killed from pro-governmental by demonstrators, and there are also terrible situations, but less, of course. But on the other hand, that there were problems in prisons, that they acknowledged that. And we came into certain agreements, because our objective is to have a presence, physical presence there, first to people, and then hopefully to open an office there, because we believe that our presence in countries does not change everything fantastically, but has the possibility of engaging with government, give technical cooperation when they're asked for, but also be able to monitor from inside and not from remote, as we have been doing all the time from remote, and to have relation with civil society, with different people.
But are you allowed to, the people, you say you have 2 people there now?
Well, we had 2 people, but they went out for holidays. And now we're in the process to discuss with the government, because they were not meant to stay there, because they have other families elsewhere and so on. So now we're in the process to work to obtain the other 2 people to go there and to stay there. And to be able to visit the prisons, and to be able to continue the job we have been doing. And also because they asked us for 2 technical things. One was that we could help them in an assessment of how it was working, the Commission on Prevention of Torture. And the other one is on prisons, because they do have, not on the federal prisons, but they have a lot of people detained by more common, things, crimes, not politically detainees, at the municipality level, and they're terrible. They're overcrowded, very bad conditions, and so on. So I describe myself as a strategically optimist, tactically not that much in the world, and also here. So we are insisting in this approach. If it doesn't work, we'll think on other approaches.
You were critical also of the sanctions imposed on Venezuela.
Oh, yes.
And I suppose one of the things that gets forgotten in the headline making of what's happening in Venezuela and the images of the streets unrest and so on is that America is not trusted, actually, in Venezuela, even by many people who would oppose Nicolas Maduro, because, of course, the story goes that the CIA supported the coup against Hugo Chavez, which in the end helped him consolidate his power. How do you deal with that end of the story? That you have this hugely powerful regional neighbor who is involved. How do you get involved in that side of it? Yes, you can go to Venezuela and say, this is bad, you need to improve, but how do you relate to Washington?
Well, I went to Washington in some minute, and I met with parliamentarians, both sides, and also with the State Department, with OAS, of course, with all the IDB, all the different important elements of both World Bank, IMF, and so on. And talking to the State Department, when they asked me, I gave them my opinion. And what I think needs to be done. Of course, every country will do what they decide in terms of strategies. But I'm against sanctions. I mean, the EU, for example, has a different point of view. They do sanctions that are personal sanctions to people who they feel have committed whatever, important violation of something. But these global sanctions, when, for example, you sanction that everyone that cannot receive money from PDVSA, that's the oil industry. But why I mention this? Because in this meeting with these doctors and nurses and mothers, many of the humanitarian situation is so bad that hospital does have nothing. So you have these children who need transplant, kidney transplant, or how you call that, bone transplant, and they cannot do it. So
bone marrow, I think.
Yes. And they cannot do it, and these children will die. And many of them have been for years, for example, treated by leukemia, gone well, but then they need now this, otherwise they will have again the problem. And then the PDVSA gave the money, they send it to the bank, but the bank won't send it to the hospital. So many of the children have died because they had not been intervened, but the money was there. So that's why I spoke to Elliot Abraham. He called me really because he heard what I mentioned about the sanctions, and he said to me, but this is over compliance of banks. So the Treasury issues something saying accepted medicine, so and so, but over compliance exists. I mean, even not only banks, also companies. These companies for example, they had a big ship in Panama with medicines and so on that wouldn't go to Venezuela because they're afraid of reprisals, So that exists. So that's why I'm against this broad sanctions that really are hurting people, and are not bringing the government down if that's what the US wants, but are hurting people, are making even worse the humanitarian situation. On the 19th of August, the UN started the humanitarian response plan, and we're looking forward to reach in 6 months 2.6 million people with food, medicines, and so on. And we're hoping that donors come with money to support those people that are really having a bad time. When I was there, the average salary was $9 a month, and now it's $7 a month. And what it was said by an expert is that you would need 41 salaries to get enough money to buy the main food basket. So that's the situation. So they have these programs, they call it missions, where they give food to people through the club government and La Patria plans. But now the sanctions are over them as well. So I'm concerned that because of political strategy, people could even suffer more. And the second thing that you can have afterwards is that people will migrate even more if they don't see any possibility, if they are suffering so much. So I try to talk with everyone and say, look, this is not working, this is not good, people are suffering, etc.
You called it strategic optimism. I call it astonishing patience, to be honest. I'm a bit embarrassed because I wanted to talk to you about the importance of gender rights, and we left it rather late in the conversation, and it should have been earlier. Because I can't think of any human rights issue that doesn't in some dimension involve the repression of women's rights, actually, in the economy, the environment, and so on, the conflict, sexual violence and conflict. How will you be able to promote, because you have already this reputation as somebody who's fought for the rights of women, how will you promote that in the human rights agenda?
Well, first of all, every time I go everywhere, I speak about women's rights and speak about the pushback on women's rights, and we try to work with other colleagues in pushing women's rights. We, in country, even here in the Western Balkans, we work with or promoting women's rights organizations, supporting youth programs where girls and boys were included. So we, at the country level, we do a lot of work on promoting women's rights, and but as part of the agenda, as part of the Agenda 2030, as part of the agenda of the United Nations. But also, I always try to bring, when I'm discussing different issues, what can be the contribution of women? I mean, it's not only the right thing to do again, it's the smart thing to do. I mean, I used to, because in Chile, you know, football is very loved sport. I used to use, and men love sport usually, and you have to deal with a lot of men leaders. So I will always use the example that we will never be able to, we won the America's Cup a couple of years ago. We were very proud about that. So we will say we have never been able to win the America's Cup and then the Centenarian Cup in New York, in US, if we had half of the football team. So we need the whole team. I mean, men and women with all the capacities, their skills, to be able to, if you want to either address poverty, inequalities, sustainable development, climate change, you need women's contribution. I mean, women really are a very important part of the communities. And they really contribute, even though they're discriminated, even though they have a lot of restriction in many places. And even though all of these complex situations in the world, the mix of climate change, migration, conflicts, sexual violence, affect particularly women, because they usually are more vulnerable, they have less tools, if I may say, to respond to these difficult circumstances. And also because if you have a pregnant woman or a breastfeeding woman and food insecurity affects her, it will affect her, the child. If you have huge, complicated situation, there are people who start thinking on arranging early child marriage as a coping strategy. So women are particularly affected in many things. But they also can be agents of change.
I mean, you can go to another end of the scale, to the highly developed countries like South Korea, for example, which has such a low birth rate. I mean, that's a gender rights issue. The women either work or they have babies because there's no support system.
Yeah, but it's so easy to do that. I mean, that one of the main things that I did in my government is, because when I had to study having a baby and I had to work having a baby, so I really started with a very strong program on a nursery, daycare centers and kindergartens for the poorest people, because I could pay, because I was from the middle class, but other people cannot pay. So, so it's so important, it's so easy, and you can provide all the circumstances. And also, not only official nurseries, you can also provide, for example, women at the marketplace, when they sell their products, you can have places there. And when I was at UN Women with Ellen Selin Johnson on Levaria, we inaugurated one important marketplace for women, that where there was a place where children could stay, take care while the mothers were working. So there's lots of things that can be done. They're so easy. And I think but you have to be aware, and you have to have gender perspective, because what I have seen in life is that not every woman has a gender perspective. Huh? Some people, for example, when I went to Davos, and I talked to a lot of very important women, businesswomen, and they said to me, look, I'm doing fine, but not because I'm a woman, it's because I'm good. And I would say, well, I was elected president despite being a woman, to be honest, but because I was president, I didn't want to miss any of those good women that usually are invisible. So let's visibilize them and give them the opportunities to do what they want to do in life. So I'm telling you this because countries on climate change and other issues, you need to have gender-responsive policies. Otherwise, you will never get to gender equality and women's empowerment. And you will losing, giving them not a good situation in life, and losing a tremendous potential.
I want to open the discussion to the floor in a moment. I just wanted to ask you about something which you mentioned to me, and I hadn't seen it as a human rights issue, and that's artificial intelligence. Perhaps you could tell us what you meant.
Well, as I mentioned to you, we are dealing always in the office with the traditional human rights issues like political and civil rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, and gender rights. But we're also trying to go into what some people call frontier issues, like climate change and, of course, technology and human rights, artificial intelligence. What we have seen, when we do discuss about the 4.0 industrial revolution, artificial intelligence, innovation, and so on, it looks like a scenario full of opportunities. And that's true. I mean, all of that could be used for the good of humanity. But on the other hand, we have seen that social media has been used as hate speech, and had triggered violence in Myanmar, for example, or in other parts of the world. We have seen that facial recognition used in some places can lead to, to detention of human rights defenders, can lead to, and it has been proved that those algorithms are gender bias and Afro-descent bias. So even some of these very important companies are not selling them to police because they wanted to use it for recognizing criminals and so on, because they have bias. So we are working on how, with companies in the US and Canada, and we'll work on other countries as well, how we can think on technology and artificial intelligence, but other algorithms as well, that can help to improve people's life, welfare and so on, in terms of health and many things, information, knowledge, etc. But on the other hand, avoid the bad part of it, the risk, the threats. And this is a very difficult discussion right now, because you have, on one hand, the public sector that have different opinion, private sector that, of course, they are market-oriented, that's the main issue. Then you have civil society, has their own perspective, the academia, the scientists. So what the UN wants to do is to be a convening power, to put everyone together to say, look, we need to do this, and we need to do it fast, because technology is advancing so fast that if we don't do it soon, we will be late. And there was one man in Canada who was telling me that they were working on robot soldiers that will target people through facial recognition. And do you imagine a robot soldier? Some of these experts say, oh, robots won't have the bias of human beings, but they don't have either the capacity of making decisions based on ethics situation as well. So this person, he is developing the system, but he thinks it's terribly dangerous. So you see, if we are late on this, we might have a lot of consequences that are really bad. So that's why we believe, and many of the companies, what are they doing is trying to deal with the ethics office. So the ethics office tells them this is okay, but ethics changes from one country to another, from one company to another. So we need to think on this soon. The Secretary General is very active on this. And I don't know if we will need, because the world does not have much appetite for treaties or whatever. I don't know if a global compact, I mean, the exact instrument, I don't know. But we need to have some sort of regulation that, on one hand, can avoid bad things from happening, improve good things. On the other hand, fight hate speech, but not to constrain freedom of speech. So it's a very delicate and difficult, if I would say, almost surgical thing that we need to work on. But if we don't do it, we might regret it.
And democratic governments tend to be left behind, actually. I think, was it Bill Clinton or George W. Bush, I can't remember, who said that the internet will mean the freedom genie is out of the bottle. Well, that didn't quite work out, did it? And I'm extremely alarmed by the idea that we will have facial recognition killer robots, because the South Wales police used this system to try to spot football hooligans in a crowd, and they got a 92% fail rate.
Yes,
so,
it's true. Yes.
I'd like to open the discussion to the floor, of course. I haven't talked about Hong Kong. I think maybe somebody would like to ask that question, but if there is any, because clearly that's a very topical human rights issue, but let me ask you to begin, and I think there'll be a microphone, somebody will bring you a microphone so that what you say.
Not directly Hong Kong, but China.
Okay, just wait for the microphone, because I think the discussion is also recorded, which is helpful to others. Would you mind saying who you are?
Yeah, Jens Wagner from the German Foreign Office. In recent years, we have seen that China has become a lot more active in Geneva, bringing in new resolutions, often trying to redefine and, in effect, weaken human rights. And they've been quite successful with that, partly because they have support from governments in the global south, including governments which are democratically elected and which domestically do seem to care about improving the human rights situation. The reason for that seems to be that alliances in Geneva are often not built on shared values, but still on this old perception of the West and the rest. How can this be overcome?
Well, I don't know if that's specific of Geneva or the whole intergovernmental processes. that people relate by different interests, not only share principles. And you can see people who speaks one way but sell weapons in the other way. So it's not only about China, it's about many places. And you see this sort of, if you look at it from a purist point of view, it looks very paradoxical. Even countries who sell weapons to some places, then they give humanitarian aid to those countries where the weapons kill them. So I've seen all of this, and that's probably why Said was so angry, because he was so sort of felt that this kind of things were not what he liked. I would say what we have been doing in the office is trying to engage all governments to try to do the right thing. But I think that what many countries, not only China, because probably the G77 thinks the same, they feel that the more important human rights needs to be preserved is right to development. But right to development, you know, the mandate is of the High Commissioner. It's my mandate to ensure right to development. But right to development is not only to feed the people, no? Because some people sometimes say, well, what we hear in discussions, not only in Geneva, also in New York, is that I have to feed my people there first, and then I will give them the freedom of speech, participation, assembly, etc., etc. And that we tell them, look, human rights are universal, are indivisible. You cannot choose which will be the first you're going to do and then the other ones. And you need to do all of them. But the right to development, to be honest, includes also political participation, rule of law, and a lot of other things. So we try to build on those. Okay. Many African countries, they always talk about right to development. So we say, okay, but right to development doesn't mean only to feed people. It means all of this. So let's work on that. Let me provide you to technical cooperation. So I think that it might sound naive to you, but it's not naive because I'm realistic on the other hand. To work with member states, to try to support their needs, can make them many times have a position that can be very helpful. I would say all big powers have their own interest in many of these discussions. Some of them are more, but we also have another, I would say there are other couple of situations where we see a speech against human rights. The other reason is we are fighting extremism, so we need security. But of course they accuse a journalist to be an extremist, so they put him into jail, and it's opposition, but not clearly an extremist. So we need to work very strongly with countries to try to change those perceptions. We are fighting against death penalty. In some places, and lots of countries have death penalty. In some places we work on what can be done. We try to push for moratoria, or not to the effective implementation of death penalty. In some other countries, we try to push forward to abolition of death penalty. So I would say we're trying to, with each country, including China, when we work with them, we tell them the problems that you have, this is the kind of things that we want to do. We would like to visit some provinces in your country, et cetera, et cetera. We'll see if it works. We're working on that. And in Hong Kong in particular, it's a non-induced question that you did that. Well, we have been in touch with the authorities and the local authorities in terms of promoting what, fortunately, Carrie Lam has asked for, is to try to promote a transparent and effective dialogue with the people, so they can try to find a political and a peaceful solution. I think it's encouraging that she called on that. She called for that platform. It looks like it hasn't worked yet, but we will be pushing towards, because we condemn violence. We condemn the violence if there is security forces violence, but we also condemn the violence when you see people with Molotov cocktails and so on. We believe that the only possible solution is a peaceful solution. And I forgot to say that. The same with Venezuela. We're really supporting the discussion that Oslo was presiding, that were held in Barbados, They are a little bit suspended, but we really think the only possible solution has to be within Venezuelan people, and they have to find a political solution to the conflict.
The problem with Hong Kong is you might not be talking to the people who are making decisions, but we'll come back to that in a moment. Any further question? There's
Comments?
a woman here. If we could get the microphone in the middle, woman in white.
Here, there.
If you could introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. My name is Nikolina Cenic. I work with the Minorities Protection with the OSCE mission in Kosovo. And just before this panel, we've had discussion on the resources on the move, so the migration, as some call it, phenomenon or even issue, which is a very negative connotation to it. And one of the conclusions, something that some of the panelists have highlighted earlier was that we need to look at what is the motivation for all these people changing moving away from their countries, moving away from their families and friends. What is their motivation? What are the problems that they're faced with? And then, they are stranded either at the sea or in the borders. And I was wondering if, as part of your monitoring functions of OHCHR, do you connect through monitoring of human rights to different mechanisms? Do you find these root causes? Do you connect them with why are people leaving? With why do they not have access to some of the basic services in their homes of origin? Thank you.
Yeah, I think I mentioned a little bit about that before, that I think that in the heart of all conflicts and of course of migration, particularly, being it by different issues, conflict or climate change or poverty and or huge rates of youth unemployment in many parts of the world, people look for better opportunities and they want to leave. And sometimes because it's a question of life or death. Huh? So, and I think the causes are very well known. It might change from one place to another, but they're really very well known. I just mentioned in another meeting we had earlier that, for example, when you see the situation of the caravans in Central America towards the Mexico, there is three main reasons, if I may say. One of them is insecurity. I mean, people who can lose their lives because they don't want to work with the Maras or the other sort of criminal gangs that are there, or they have the risk of human trafficking of the children and they want better things for them. The other is poverty. And the third, if I may say, it's also what we would say climate change, because in many of these places people will work at the coffee plantations, and a virus has come into the coffee plantations, so they could not collect a lot of coffee, so they lost their jobs and they need to find something else. So, but if you go to Africa and other places, you will find that people, even it could be migrants or IDPs, internal displaced persons. It's also due to huge droughts, or, for example, in many of the islands who are vulnerable, there's like a call B20, like the most vulnerable countries to, mainly island, but not only island, to climate change, where the the rising of high levels of the sea has made whole coastal borders don't exist anymore, villages don't exist anymore, and all those people had to displace internally, in Fiji, in Vanuatu, in many different places. So this is not a threat for the future. It's happening today. It's happening for some time. So people moves because of very concrete issues, and I think that's why I mentioned before that unless we tackle the root causes, migration will be a reality, because people, of course, will look for better opportunities. We are working on this. We are part, as a UN, we are part of the Global Compact on Migration created a mechanism that is a coordination under the OIM leader. We are part of that. So we discuss different policies, but mainly on how we sort of support migrants, prevent things, because, for example, many women who are migrants, either they are victims of sexual violence, or victims of human trafficking. For example, there's a lot of missing girls in Mexico. Many of them is supposed to be either human trafficking for organs or sexual slavery or work slavery. So we try to work with them. We try to convince them what is the safe things. And one of the problems that we have when you have very strong anti-migration policies is that people will migrate anyway. It won't stop them, but they will look for the most unsafe ways to do it, and they will get even more in danger. So as UN, we are working on that. We try to prevent, we try to work strongly on development and how we can really give opportunities to the people, because people, it's the same thing with these young people in many parts of the world, MENA region, but also Africa, that I've seen that the levels of, first of all, of youth on those countries, 70% of the population can be under 30 or 35. And then you have 70% of youth unemployed. And in some countries not so far away, like Tunisia and others, they have high levels of tertiary education. So they expect to have a job. They went to the university, but afterwards they're unemployed. And in many of these cases, not in all of them, particularly in the ones who had no education, who had no chances, many of these rebel groups, extremist groups, come close to them and tells them they will have opportunities, money, guns, they will have the power. So when you see these people, young, normal people, going to Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab or other extremist groups, it's because they don't see any opportunity in their life. So the reasons are well known. It's, of course, there can be other reasons as well. But there are developmental reasons that if we really, and that's why I truly believe the Agenda 2030 with the Sustainable Development Goals, plus the Paris Agreement and the Climate Action Plan from Katowice last year, if we really, member states, take it seriously and do accelerate efforts, and we get there by 2030, I think we could prevent a lot of things from happening. Because if we really leave no one behind, people will have other opportunities in life. They won't need to go to this, they don't want need to migrate, they won't need to go to this extremist group. It's not perfect, we will still have conflicts in the world, but I'm sure it will help so much to avoid what's happening today. And it is an issue of inequalities. So us in the office, usually our main fight in the past was against impunity. And of course we are still against impunity on violation of human rights. But we're also dealing directly on inequalities, because we believe that inequalities are, as I said, in the heart of many of these processes.
The theme of this BLED Strategic Forum seems to be that multilateralism is the only way. If you're dealing with, coffee virus or climate change, multilateralism is the only way. And yet we have the most powerful economy led by somebody who doesn't support multilateralism. Do you think there is still a place for these UN systems, including the one that you run? How do you contest that cynicism about multilateralism?
I mean, I think that if the criticism is that the UN system needs to be improved, of course, I mean, every system can improve, and that's the objective of the reforms, the management reform, the development reform, and the peace and security reform that the governments approved. And of course, it's just in its way, so we're not going to see results immediately. But I hope that this will help a lot, and we always need to show to member states that we are efficient, that we're doing our job, that we're having results, etc. But to be honest, I think until now, the big majority of countries do understand that multilateralism is the only possible way of dealing with global challenges. No one will solve none of the issues we have been talking about internally. It's not possible. I mean, borders are not that high. I mean, even Ebola, I mean, diseases. I mean, nobody says, oh, stop here, here's the frontier. So we need to deal with global challenges and in a global way. And that is multilateralism. And multilateralism is also the way of small countries and big countries feeling respected as equal. And so sometimes you listen to a language that is like, like you cannot be a patriot and believe in multilateralism. Patriotic person is a person who believes in its nation. But that doesn't mean that it's in contradiction with being somebody who understands that his nation will be better if everyone is better, and that we can have common responses. But the world is, as you say, but I was mentioning the Global Compact was approved by 150, not by 193 countries, but for 159 countries. And there are others that were in the process, internal discussions about that. So, and some countries did not approve it and now are approving it. So I still believe that the majority of countries do believe that multilateralism is the answer.
Question from this lady here.
Thank you. Milena Schmidt, a former Slovenian diplomat. Thank you very much, High Commissioner, for your thoughts. I would say that the discourse of the human rights as women's rights changed during some recent years. Before, there was a firm conviction that, as you said, all human rights are indivisible and universal. So, women's rights were always human rights, and vice versa. So, I will ask you about a very controversial subject, the abortion. Let's say reproductive rights are really maybe only human rights that are somehow women's rights. And so the right for abortion, or at least, let's say, depenalization, seemed a few years ago as an acquired right, nearly. But yet we see, as you mentioned also at the beginning, that we can observe a real pushback. We are concerned what is happening in the United States. You know that there is a lot of women that are at least hampered or really somehow that are having a great difficulties to make a legal abortion. And the trend is going this way also in Europe. On the other side, we know also that many European enterprises say clearly and bluntly to young women that they shouldn't be pregnant unless losing the job or not acquire, let's say, a permanent position. So the situation is really a little bit schizophrenic. I will ask you, because I know that you had also in your presidential campaign problems with this in Chile, as also other countries is having the same problems. But nevertheless, I will ask you, do you feel in your function empowered enough to somehow tackle this question in a way that at least there won't be a more pushback? Thank you.
I don't know if I'm empowered enough, but I will do what I think I have to do in this regard. If I have results or not, well, that will be seen, but I will try to convince people to do the right thing, because I did it when I was Minister of Health and when I was President. This is an issue that I'm a doctor, so and I'm women, so I believe women have, I don't understand that women can be elected president, they can vote, but they cannot decide about the body, about how many children have and how they want to space them. For me, this is an artificial discussion, because women should have the possibility of making lots of decisions according to their own values, their own belief, their own tradition, etc. But they should have the possibility, you know. And I do believe that the state needs to give alternatives for women, and they will choose according to their own beliefs and so on. But it's not the state who can impose women a determined position. Is there a pushback? A strong pushback. A strong pushback. There was a Security Council resolution on women victims of sexual violence who could not include the word sexual and reproductive services And it was for victims of sexual violence in conflict settings. It's not for the women of the world. And an important country vetoed that. So when you see that, and I went to talk to some Congress, and I was told you can raise the issue of LGBTIQ and it won't be any problem, but don't raise the issue of sexual and reproductive rights. So it's, as you say, one of the things we have seen with human rights, not only on this area, and others, is that things that you thought were won forever, they're not there. And that tells us how we need to constantly continue making advocacy, lobbying, fighting for human rights. Because to tell the truth, coming from South America, I would have never thought that in Europe I would have seen what I've seen some years in terms of xenophobia, in terms of hate speech, in terms of anti-Islamic, anti-Semitic, in terms of anti-migrant. I would have never thought that I would see, because for me Europe was like the continent of the values, of the welfare, or the social, of solidarity, etc., etc. I have seen what I've seen, of course, and countries are not perfect and so on, but one of the things that I always say is that leaders have the responsibility to lead their countries also on principles and values. And one of the problems that you see sometimes is that you gain more votes having that kind of speech than a very open-minded, embracing a speech, embracing the respect for diversity, etc., because it looks like in a world that has been living with so many uncertainties, fear is something that is making people make decisions. And I think leaders should try to cope fears and not provoke more fears. And they should try to sort of send a message that is a message founded in important values. In the past, when I was young, it was politically incorrect to say some things. Now it looks like anybody can say whatever they want. It's not politically incorrect. My question, though, to be honest, I have asked myself, was it that always people thought like this and they didn't dare to speak out loud? And now they dare because they see big leaders saying this kind of stuff? Or was it that people have changed and it's uncertainty that brings out the best and the worst of people? This is a more philosophical question that I've asked myself that I don't have the answer. Probably there was always people that were anti, but it was not politically correct to say it.
I think you've touched on the answer. It's leadership, actually.
Yes, leadership, indeed.
And if you can use this kind of issue to generate power for yourself, then that's leadership, that may be the wrong kind. I think we're about to overrun our time, but if there are more questions, we could take a couple more if anybody has questions. Yes, over here, please. We'll take yours first, if you don't mind. Just get in here.
Hi, I'm Marika Jolai. I'm a senior researcher at the European Institute for Minority Issues and head of conflict and security cluster. And actually I was thinking about something that we heard in the previous session, which was on security. And that is that today, 1 in 4 millennials of the new generation don't see democracy as the right system for the societies in which they live. So I was thinking maybe if you can say something about how to address, this issue and how to stand up and apply human rights in these societies and with these young people who obviously, if they don't believe in democracy, they don't believe in human rights either. And this is a problem which is, it's not an individual country then, where you then go and you have a strategy for the government and you think about how to approach them, but it's more on a systemic level. So is there a crisis of human rights which is related to the crisis of democracy that we're seeing and witnessing nowadays globally?
And before you answer that, let's ask this gentleman to give his question as well.
have a number of questions, but I will ask just one now.
Could you say who you are?
Sorry, I'm Martijn Pluim, Director for Migration Dialogues and Cooperation at the International Center for Migration Policy Development in Vienna. And one of the questions actually related to how are you able to, your office able to react to upcoming potential major crises, like you see in India and Assam, where quite a large number, millions of people have been denied the citizenship or have been saying you're not in citizenship. Do you have the tools to say, okay, I can react to this and I can also raise the awareness on how to address it, even if it's, I don't know enough about whether the decision of the new government is right or not right, but the impact on the 2 million people will be enormous as well as on the neighboring countries. So I don't want to give a judgmental, because it is a 40-year process on coming to this figure, but what is the tools that you have in your office to address such forthcoming, for sure, human rights challenges?
Thank you so much.
Well, the first tool that we have is to raise our concern with government, so we have already done it. And we have asked for the, in the case of Assam in particular, on this national registry system, they have appealed to the justice system, and this is being discussed. So it might change if I don't remember exactly which institutions are dealing with it, that could think on a different approach and could include more people. But we have raised the concern with the Indian government, and we have asked them to ensure that people will be protected and not will be, because what will happen to them is they will be stateless. And we're seeing that in many parts of the world, and there's other, sorry to mention this, it's not exactly migration, but for me it's very important as well. And I'm going back to your question afterwards. It's the foreign fighters, their wives and the children. I'm really concerned about that, because nobody is really, at least publicly, dealing with that. And what is happening is that states are sort of saying, no, he's not my citizen, he's not my citizen, and they're becoming stateless, no? And they are in a so unsafe situation. I mean, and you see those women and children are still in those camps in Syria, and many of them dying there. And also you have all these children that both parents were killed, and they are there. Who is going to take care of all of these children? And many of these, I mean, I understand that if you were a foreign fighter, you have to held accountable if you did crimes, and you have to go to justice, and you will have due process, etc., etc. If you were a woman, just a wife, but not a fighter, they were 14 years old when they left the country sometime, 13. I mean, I still remember those two girls in the UK that they were, you remember they took the pictures when they were going into the airport and so on. So, and even children that may have been fighters, but they're children. And the international law explains that children should not be detained, and we need to respect all those issues. But I think the world doesn't know how to deal with this issue. And it's not an easy issue, but it's have a lot of people who are really suffering, and we need to take serious concern about it. We are working with UNICEF, trying to have common approaches on this issue. And we are raising, and in the last meeting in the Human Rights Council, I spoke a lot about this, calling member states to really deal with it. Some countries have done, they have brought back some of their, even from Eastern Europe, and have brought back some of these citizens.
Could you name them?
No, I won't, because I don't remember all of them. And then if I name two, and not all of them are very good in human rights, but they brought these people back. So that was a good thing, but not necessarily means that everything is fantastic. And even countries in Asia, they have brought some of it. But in some places, for example, they have put them in this so-called, what they call it, the de-radicalization camps. And I'm not talking about China, I'm talking about other countries. And because, of course, they are afraid to bring these people back to the society when they were used to use the violence and were killing people. So how they integrate them? So I think this is a very complicated situation, political, human rights situation, but doesn't have an answer yet. On the issue of democracy.
Disenchantment with democracy.
Yeah, well, it will depend a lot on countries, because I think it's very different youth in Europe than youth in Africa when they don't have employment, they don't have education. It's different. I mean, they don't believe in politics, they don't believe in democracy, because really democracy is not bringing them any benefits. So for them, being it in a democratic or a nepotic regime doesn't change their lives. And I think one of the problems of democracy is that democracy has to deliver. The other thing is that democracy is not about voting. It's about having democratic ways of living every day, because what people feel is that they elect government, but then governments don't have the results they expected, and there's not other kind of participation. I'm talking, of course, of countries that do have. And on the other hand, in some parts of the world, they don't see the differences. So they started making their own movements. And the other thing is, I think politics have lost touch with their citizens. And you need to bring back the relationship between citizens and politics to talk about what people's concerns are. And one of the things that we are trying to get involved much more with youth, to let them know what their human rights are, because it's not that they don't care about the human rights. Many of them don't even know what the human rights are. Many believe that human rights, they have it, they take it for granted, so they don't care because it's there, but they do care about specific issues. And one or two areas where I've seen that youth is really into it, one is climate change, because it's their future and the future of them. And also technology, for example. So I'm always trying to find ways, entry point with youth, that can be interesting for them. I think political people need to seriously look at why this disconnect, this huge disconnect, because it's not in one single continent, as you mentioned. It's much more wider. Why and I don't know, I always felt that in politics, if you want to be successful, you should not promise what you knew you won't be able to achieve, and that you should always speak frankly to people when you were not able to achieve because of other reasons. There are ways of doing politics that can be more closer to the people. But I think we have a serious lack of credibility on politics, and youth need role models, and I think we have a problem of leadership in the world as well. We need more role models that can incentivize, stimulate people to feel that it's important. Some people want to do things. It's not that young people are not interested in politics because they don't care. It's not that. They do care. I mean, there might be some who don't care, but a lot of young people really, really care. And I think there has been a sort of disconnect from what people care and what politics is about. And sometimes you look at the news and it's discussing things that people really don't care about it. So far away from people's issues and problems and concerns. So this is something that I have given lots of thoughts, don't have the solution yet. And I think it's, again, the world has been changing and we haven't been able to change with a pace as fast as we need to include all the new challenges, the new characteristics. So I was hoping that from the Bled Strategy Forum we will have the answer.
There have been plenty of answers, but whether anybody's
listening. The
yeah.
solutions.
High Commissioner, it's been really great, and it's exciting to talk about these issues at length, and thank you very much indeed for giving us your time. Are you excited by this job?
Well, people ask me, do you enjoy it? And say, enjoy it? No, that's not a word that I could use. I think it's a very challenging job. And also, because I don't try to sell me stories. I say, okay, I think this is the best approach. But if I don't succeed, I will think I had to change my approach. I had to leave, whatever. Because I think the important thing is to be in a job where you believe in what you're doing. And that you really are committed to it. And you might make good things, you might make mistakes. That's part of human life. But the important thing is to believe that this is important, and I do believe that it's important. It's a very tough job because you have to deal with the nasty part of humankind, if I may say, with all these bad things of power. of how people forget what power is for, is to serve the people and not to serve themselves or the group. And every day, the news, the briefings they give me, it's about that part. So that's not the most, that's why I'm saying that tactically I'm not so positive, but strategically, yes. But the only thing is I cannot help it, and I'll do my best while I'm here in this job, and hopefully we can engage more people and to be able to work together, because again, myself alone, I'm not going to have the results. We need to work together. And we have a lot of members that are very supportive, politically and financially as well. And I think that, others not, of course, but the big majority they are. So I'm enthusiastic. I mean, I don't know how much it will last, but I'm still enthusiastic. That's why I've spoken so much.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan.
Michelle Bachelet.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's fascinating, really
Thank you very much.
fascinating.
Thank you. I hope it was not very boring.
It wasn't boring at all.